Hey review family, keep it high, keep it tight. My name is Jay Morse, the review guy reviewing music for the love of music, and I'm back again to bring you another video. And in this one I'm going to be covering the new Darkthrone record entitled Eternal Hails. At this point, I don't think that the Norwegian band Darkthrone needs much of an introduction for how instrumental they have been in just pretty much the development of the early Norwegian black metal style. Darkthrone in their peak took a lot of inspiration from much of what was happening in the mid to late 80s, and when they entered the early 90s, they created some of the most iconic, notorious records and recognizable records in all of black metal, with iconography that has stamped itself on the face of the genre. Their second, third, and fourth record are albums that you can't step 2 feet into the black metal genre without finding someone that will infinitely praise them to the ends of the earth. And that has spawned for good reason. The legacy that they've left behind and the imprint that they have left not only on Norwegian black metal, but black metal as a whole, can't really be looked past. Now, while their style was extremely influential at the time, groundbreaking and unique, albeit a little bit derivative from some of the bands that they were borrowing influence from, the Celtic Frost, the Bathories of the world, Darkthrone basically saw an evolutionary period throughout the late 90s and leading into the 2000s, taking their style and incorporating so many more elements from other genres, whether it be crust punk or classic heavy metal, rock and roll, doom metal, and just a lot of other things that never had really been played around with by the band. Up until that point, yes, like I said, they were unique, but their first records are pretty clear-cut, raw, primitive, very low-fidelity black. You can't really call it anything else. Now, Darkthrone have been decently prolific in the 2010s, and I've been decently critical of them ever since. Albums like The Underground Resistance and Arctic Thunder and their most recent Old Star, in my opinion, really had the spirit of Darkthrone, but with the new elements. But in my opinion, I think the way that they played around with classic heavy metal and the way that they played around with classic doom metal at times left a lot to be desired, as it felt like the influences that they were pulling from other areas were nothing but very on the nose. While there were smidgens of it prior, The Underground Resistance was when Darkthrone really dipped their toes into the fountain of bands like Motorhead and bands like Black Sabbath and bands like Candlemass. But on Eternal Hails, with over 40 minutes of runtime, they sort of begin the 2020s with a record that I think sweeps away a lot of what they released in the 2010s, although I do think that it has some flaws to it. Eternal Hails once again follows in the footsteps of Motorhead and Black Sabbath, the very classic thick sound to it. It's amazing to me that Darkthrone can manage to become less and less well produced and more raw and more old school with every single release. It's sort of comparable to what you see from a lot of sludge metal and stoner rock bands nowadays, where they choose to adopt a style that in their sludginess and in the psychedelic nature of their sound, they have a style, they have a production that intentionally goes for an old school tone. Darkthrone's pretty much the same way here. A lot of these tracks do reach decent lengths, and they don't really care about making something slow, something chuggy. The Black Sabbath worship is on full display. This might sound crazy, but I think this is one of Darkthrone's least black metal sounding records. And contrary to what people might think, tracks like Wake of the Awakened, in my opinion, that speed metal throttle, that 1970s speed metal throttle is just Darkthrone's obviously played around with longer tracks, and this record only has 5 tracks on it despite its long runtime. Progressively, it's not the most technically impressive or anything along those lines, but they do put a lot of back into making sure these tracks have spine to them, have bite to them. And bite it does have, but just sort of in the antique-y way, like this record kind of is trapped in antiquity. And while I think it's cool that Darkthrone is paying homage to these old styles like they pretty much have been for record after record after record after record here, most of my issues still lie with the whole derivative thing. But I don't want to dwell on that for so long that I don't talk about what's great about this record. And there's a lot to love. Like I said, pretty much all of these tracks have bite to them, and it's more so these slower sections, sort of the Candlemass-centered sound that was present on like Old Star and Arctic Thunder. I think that's when this record can sort of get snagged into monotony and become a little tedious. But the fact that Darkthrone is able to so successfully sort of manufacture this old school sound, I hear a lot of bands from a lot of genres, specifically death metal and black metal and doom metal, and to a lesser degree sludge, that try to sound like the old school so hard that they miss the mark and sound sort of try hard, that like they're really going over the top to try to capture that. Darkthrone does it with taste, they do it with grace. While the lengths of these songs are very ambitious, I was consistently impressed by how they just would go from their more black metal roots to some speed metal to some doom metal, and even if it wasn't necessarily the most interesting at any given time, you had to respect the heart that was packed in. I am pleased to report, though, that Eternal Hells has some great riff work on it, some very demonic, twisted up sounding riffs, although I wish that Darkthrone would lay a little less into speed metal and sort of merge their own black metal styles for riff writing and put that with the throttle. Because there's nothing wrong with worshipping the old school, but when you have pounds and pounds and pounds and just mountains full of these heavy metal worship bands and an even bigger mountain of Black Sabbath worshipping bands, it's sort of hard to separate some of what Darkthrone does across this record and what some of those lesser known bands, some of those less seasoned bands are putting forth, and I think that's kind of funny. This is completely retrograde though. From the production to the performances, it's hard to not just feel that kinetic energy and that adrenaline that grips you when you listen to some of the classics from the 70s and 80s and 90s. Yeah, they might not have been the best produced, but they had a certain amount of spit shine on the bottom of their shoes that just made it so hellish. And Darkthrone really does harness all that, embody it, and while this is something they have been continuously doing record after record, and I think it could get tiresome after a bit, Eternal Hells is a pretty damn fun ascension. Can they fall prey to being on the nose? Yes. Can they fall prey to some lackadaisical songwriting? Yes. Can they feel a little bit try-hard at times? Yes. But Darkthrone, after all these years, continues to find little ways to tweak their style, and I appreciate just how little of a fuck they give about sticking to one thing. The fans know that Darkthrone is always going to be evolving and finding little ways to change up their style and still pay homage to the past. And I think even though it is derivative, and even if it is on the nose and just heavily inspired, they sometimes sound better than the bands that they are pulling from. They sometimes sound better than the Bathories and the Motorheads and the Celtic Frosts. These bands that paved the way for their sound, I think Darkthrone bears the torch and carries it in such a noticeably respectful way. It never sounds like they are just pulling it for the sake of being trendy, and it's hard for me not to have a profound amount of respect for how they just continue to say, we're keeping it evil, we're keeping it heavy, and even the album title reflects that. The Hells, the iconography, it's so old school, it's just dripping with that flavor, even if the songwriting isn't the strongest. So while I am a staunch advocate for some of Darkthrone's earliest material and some of their late 90s and early 2000s output, and I think that for experimentation purposes I prefer their little stint into crust punk and blackened crust, comparatively speaking, with their heavy metal shit, I still think that this is a record that just is going to blow you away this year, if nothing else from how well they capture the sound. It's not really for me all the way, and that mostly comes down to hearing a lot of other bands that do exactly what Darkthrone does here, but the gusto and the amount of grit and tenacity and intensity that they perform these riffs with some pretty clever songwriting more often than not, and a production that pays homage without sounding just stupid, makes this record more often than not a good listen, something worth your time, and something that I have a lot of respect for. And I definitely am constantly looking forward to what Darkthrone poses in the future every time they come out with a new record. But I'm going to be giving this album a 6.5 out of 10. And that is a wrap. Have you heard this new Darkthrone record, Eternal Hells? If you have, let me know in the comment section below what you thought about it. I would love to discuss this record with you. Be sure to like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to join the review family today, and smash that notification bell to be notified of my future uploads. You know who it is, my name is Jay Morris, the Review Guy, and I'm signing off saying farewell.